So my first study addresses the global financing gaps for utility managed water supply. The photo is one I took of a typical small town water utility office in Ethiopia, where they have a mixture of paper-based and computerized software billing systems. So this paper was recently published in World Development and concerns 4 case study water utilities: Lodwar in Kenya, Kampong Chonglong in Cambodia, Woliso in Ethiopia, and Boulder, Colorado, representing 2 low-income contexts, 1 medium-income context, and 1 high-income context. And despite these different contexts, levels of investment, and typical household incomes in these 4 different towns, the 4 utilities share some common operating characteristics, especially underspending on needed capital maintenance, which is budgeting for large repairs and replacements, and is typically challenging for utilities to do long-term. So first, to address the choice in study sites, these are deliberately unfair comparisons to point out a gap in the literature around service levels. Boulder has 1,000 times as much invested in water service delivery and treatment per capita than, for example, the small town of Woliso in Ethiopia does. That's why I quantify the level of service as a function of accessibility, availability, quality, and quantity. So I quantify the level of service delivered, and I include it in the life cycle cost comparison. Boulder also has an advantage in that 60% of its revenue is paid by taxpayer investments in hydroelectricity. If you notice from that photo, right, that's the Batassa water treatment facility some of you might have visited. So the distribution lines that bring the water down to the town of Boulder have a huge incline to them. And so rather than having pressure reducing valves, which are typical in other utilities, Boulder actually captures energy at those and sells those back to the grid. So they make a significant amount of their revenue that way. It's actually 60% of the total revenue in all of Boulder. So water tariff revenues are therefore really subsidized and kept low. And in all cases, all 4 cases, they're actually too low to cover all operating costs with looking at user contributions alone. So most of the funding actually comes from institutional customers, taxpayers, indirectly or directly, or direct subsidy from donors. So as a result of underinvestment in the 2 low-income and middle-income utilities, and undersizing in the face of rapid population growth, revenue collection is low and funding gaps are growing. So of course, this is just a vicious cycle because it's really hard to qualify for financing to expand water production without a healthy balance sheet. And when there's a funding shortage, the first cost category that is underfunded is almost always capital maintenance because the consequences are not usually seen until too late. So in short, the answer to who pays for water is that governments and therefore taxpayers significantly fund water services in high-income countries, and donors need to support long-term subsidies in low-income places to cover the full cost of water services, because we know water is a public good and a human right and not something that should be run for profit. So the methodology behind this paper is that I start with an asset valuation of each utility, then break it down into the different life cycle cost components of the existing assets. Then I compare user contributions and tariffs to taxes and transfers from government and donors. And then I calculate the service levels delivered by those investments in infrastructure and management, and calculate the full cost of water service delivery, including those costs that are not currently being paid, which is deferred capital maintenance. So the full cost of water in each context is the existing utility budget plus the unfunded capital maintenance needs, and the overall financing gap is the full cost of water discounted by the service area coverage with safely managed services. So as an example of a calculation, capital maintenance needs of a submersible pump would be calculated by dividing its capital replacement value in 2018 dollars by the expected lifespan of the pump, around 10 years. When this is done for all utilities assets, the total CapManX required is compared to the expenditure on CapManX for that year. And these are some results. Note the log scale because otherwise the values for Boulder would be off the chart. So the first row, utility funding, includes domestic and commercial user contributions as well as tax or donor funds. Expenditure was less than funding in the cases of Boulder and Lodwar, but Kampong Chonglong broke even and Woliso lost money. Deferred CapManX, or capital maintenance expenditure, is the difference between the required expenditure according to the calculated capital replacement values and then the actual expenditure. So all 4 utilities had between $1 and $43 per capita in deferred maintenance costs. So next, the total cost of the water service takes into account the deferred CapManX, and then the funding gap is the revenue needed to meet that total cost. And the last 2 lines are the same calculation, but with estimating the costs of water with 100% coverage of the service area with safely managed services. So the key finding is that all 4 utilities face funding gaps for capital maintenance, especially when considering service levels, between $2 and $41 per capita.